Hi everybody, my name is David Kojil and I work with Trevor in the High Dive Lab at Harvard Medical School. I've been using anywidget in my research project and I found it really empowering, and it served as a gateway to computational notebooks for me. I don't have a lot of experience either with the traditional web development or doing data science in Python. My background is in computer graphics programming, and I thought I'd make this video to show you my anywidget project setup from a perspective of somebody who's still learning both sides of the widget ecosystem. So what I'm working on is a data visualization library. Then the gist of it is that it essentially outputs a canvas element that shows some data and allows people to interact with this data. And of course, the idea is that this library, this module, would be served on a repository like NPM or JSR for the Dino fans in the audience. And then this package, this JavaScript package, can be consumed by other applications. So for example, giving the library some more of a traditional web application interface using frameworks like React or Svelte or any other. Or the library, the visualization library, would be integrated in some other tools that we are developing in our lab. But the idea is that the library itself would not be dependent on any of these frameworks. It would be just pure ESM. But from the very beginning, I also knew that I want to have a widget version of my library, because the library is aimed at computational biologists who, of course, use Jupyter notebooks heavily. And so I wanted to have a widget that uses the JavaScript library, and I can publish this widget on PyPI for use in computational notebooks. And the specificity of my situation is that I started developing both of these parts more or less at the same time. So they have been evolving alongside. And I can imagine that's the difference from what a lot of you who work with anywidget. I assume that a lot of you already start with some JavaScript code, a library of sort, that you're trying to wrap around and make into a widget form. So as you can imagine, if you're developing both of these parts at the same time, that's a lot of moving parts and a lot of things that you have to design to align. So the setup that I came up with consists of two basically parts that are living separately. So that's the JavaScript part and the Python widget part. So I'll start with the JavaScript part first. So I'll be using a tool called Vite. I'm guessing most of you are probably familiar with this, so it's not surprising, and I'll just use the scaffolding script, pnpm create Vite, give it some name, rects lib, and I'll just use the vanilla, and I'll use TypeScript, but it doesn't change all that much. So let's take a look at this library. I'll install the dependencies and take a look what the example looks like. So if you've ever played around with Vite, I'm guessing this is going to be familiar. It's this example app with a button and a counter. Okay, so whatever showed up on this page is what you put in the index.html, and you can see that the index.html loads this main script that sets up the whole example page. So we can take a look at the main script, and that's what essentially it does. There's the button, and what I'll do is I'll just delete all of this, and I'll just write one function that is gonna make my canvas where I would put things to visualize or draw. So for now, I'll just put some placeholder here, and I'll export this function from this module. So export make canvas. Okay, so now if I spin up the dev server again, you'll notice that suddenly I don't have the example page. I just have the empty HTML page because the main script no longer kind of hooks it up together. What I can also do on this side, because Vite is doing a lot of heavy lifting, so I can actually take a look at the main.ts file in browser, and you'll see that it looks very similar like what I wrote in my text editor, just a little bit different. That's what widget does. That's the bundling step and translation from TypeScript that widget does. So I could just make it so that I can develop using the default widget index.html page, but I'll do something a little bit different, and I'll use a tool called Observable. Observable is a notebook environment that's JavaScript based. So there are differences with Jupyter beyond that as well, but I essentially use it as a prototyping environment because sometimes it really helps you to think in notebook terms already when designing the JavaScript library. So I don't remember exactly how the syntax is for loading JavaScript modules with observable. So I'll just look it up in documentation, and I know that at the end there is a way to import ESM modules. So I'll just copy that, and I see that I have some JavaScript module that's from the documentation. So instead, I want to fetch my own library. And what I'll do is I'll just load it from localhost, which is something that I can do. So I'll just replace this with localhost and fetch directly the main.ts file. And you see that I have my canvas function. If I open the console and actually call that make canvas function, I'll get my hi message from the code. Okay, so at this point, I'm starting to prototype my JavaScript part of my widget. So in order to save some time, I just asked an LLM to give me some example code. This one should generate a rectangle, an SVG with a rectangle at a random position. So I'll just take that and put it in my make canvas function. These things right here are just TypeScript type warning. So to get rid of that, I'll do this. And then I can go back to observable and make a reload, and I should get an SVG that gives me a rectangle at random position, and also, I'm guessing, random color. So if I run this, I'm getting all these different SVGs returned from the make canvas function. Okay, so that's pretty cool. And I can get to setting up the Python, the widget part. So I'll jump out of this folder, and I can also use a scaffolding script for anywidget. So it's this part, it's this package within the anywidget repository on GitHub. So I can do the same thing, pnpm create anywidget at latest, I believe. And let's call this one random rect widget. I'll just keep this vanilla JavaScript. Okay, so now we can take a look at the example widgets. So what I'll do here, I'll be using a tool for Python project management, which is called UV, extremely fast Python package and project manager written in Rust. And it is, I believe, already, Jupyter Lab is already as a dependency. So what I can just do is do UV run Jupyter Lab. And I should get that example that you might have seen somewhere already with a button and confetti. So that's the default anywidget example. So we can take a look at that. So probably if you've ever used anywidget, this is pretty familiar to you. This is the Python part, and I do have that widget.js part that uses confetti and sets up this button. So what I will do, I'll just delete everything, almost everything in the render function. And similarly to how I loaded the localhost version of the library from in observable, I can do the same thing here. So I'll do import everything as RR from HTTP localhost 5173 source main main.ts. And I don't need the confetti anymore. And I'll just get my SVG element by calling the make canvas function here, and I'll append that to the element that we get in the render function. So how does that look like? I see that we have our SVG with some rectangles, and if I reload this cell, it's going to do the same thing as in observable, generating a random rectangle at random positions. So that's looking pretty good. At this point, I could start prototyping and kind of playing around with the interface between JavaScript and Python, although I'm still only touching the JavaScript part of the widget. But the other thing that I, at the beginning, was a little confused is how does the module replacement, work? Like which parts should reload at which point, and do I need to refresh things? So let's take a look at that. I'll edit the library code so that I can specify, for one, I want to specify how many rectangles do I want to draw. So let's say num of rects is going to be a parameter. And I write a very simple loop, and the n is going to be num of rects. And I'll put this this code that actually generates the rectangles inside that for loop, and I'll also put this after the SVG definition. Okay, so now if I take a look at observable, Weed, once I save this file, Weed generated kind of process the code, so that's not a problem, but observable doesn't actually allow me to reload the library. So what I have to do on this side, I do have to do a refresh, and then I'll still see nothing because I didn't specify a parameter how many rectangles I want in that function. So if I do 100, I'm going to suddenly get 100 rectangles at random positions. I can do 1000, I can do 10. Okay, so now let's take a look at the widget, at the anywidget part. Actually, how does the hot module replacement work in anywidget? So what I'll do, I'll just show both the code and the notebook, and let's take a look. So right now, since I'm not giving it any, I'll just give it some beginning attribute, and I get my 10 rectangles. I can then change this part of the code to give 100 and take a look at what happens when I save the file. So this reloads without me needing to actually reload the Jupyter notebook or restart Jupyter lab itself. So that's pretty cool. I can play around with it, and this thing should reload after I just save the file. Okay, so now I guess if you're making a widget, you want to expose parameters like how many rectangles you wanna draw in the widget. So I'll just reuse the initial value traitlet that I have here, and I'll just use the model to fetch this value. So I can do this, and then num of rects is going to come from the model itself. So because the traitlet is set by default to 0, I'm not getting anything. So I can go back and I'll specify the value of the traitlet. So I want to have 10 rectangles. Okay, so this seems to be working. That's pretty nice. Then how does the hot module replacement work on the Python side? So let's take a look. So for example, I'll just get rid of this definition again so that it uses the default value. So right now the default value is 0. So if I run this cell, I'm getting no rectangles. And what if I change this side of the Python code to 10? So I'll save this file, nothing changes yet, but the Python code has actually been updated. I just need to run the cell again. So you see that I didn't have to, again, restart the Jupyter lab or the kernel, anything. It just works. So I can have by default 100 rectangles, and as long as I rerun the cell that generates that, that uses that widget, it should reload. Okay, so that's essentially my workflow. So I can work on both the JavaScript and Python sides, and at some point, if the design kind of becomes a little bit more stable, what I can do is I can just publish the JavaScript library to NPM and essentially use the same type of CDN import just using my library, so random rects at some version. But this process that I showed is really useful in these very early stages of prototyping where you're changing a lot and you don't know where things should align without doing the round trip of always publishing the JavaScript library if you want to work on the Python side. I hope that helps to somebody, and I'll see you on the anywidget Discord. Bye.